Good afternoon. We are delighted to have with us today Professor Margaret Urban Walker. Professor Walker is the Donald J. Schwenke Chair in the Department of Philosophy at Marquette University. Among her previous appointments were positions at Arizona State University and Fordham. Professor Walker's work focuses on themes in ethics and social philosophy, including themes in justice and moral repair in the face of disagreement and in the face of historic injustice. She is author of the book Moral Repair, Reconstructing Moral Relations After Wrongdoing, which was with Cambridge. She is also author of Moral Understandings, a feminist study of ethics. That was with Oxford, which is now available in its second edition. And also Moral Contexts, which was with Rowman and Littlefield. Among other books, Walker co-edited Naturalized Bioethics Toward Responsible Knowing and Practice, which was with Cambridge, and Moral Psychology, Feminist Ethics and Social Theory. Walker is also author of several dozen articles and chapters on themes in bioethics, moral repair, value theory, feminist ethics, and normative ethics. Professor Walker's recent research focuses on reparations, accountability, and truth-telling. The work she presents to us today is The Task of Reparations, Modeling Accountability, Here for Now. Please join me in welcoming Professor Walker.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's a nice full room. I do have to say I was just kidding about the bioethics. I don't really do that. Sometimes just, you publish something and then people think you do bioethics. So
It's our secret.
Yes. Today I'm going to talk about something I really do. This is a short version of a developing chapter of a book that I'm writing on, if I can remember the title, Reparations, Justice, Truth, and Memory in Response to the Violent Past is the name of the book. And I'm going to talk about a conception I've developed of what is really at stake, what's at the core, and hence the sort of the target aimed at in reparations as an application of reparative justice. So I'll just plunge in. The idea of making good for a wrongful loss or injury by tendering to the victim something of value, usually in a ritualized manner or in a symbolically scripted context, is ancient and seemingly spans all cultures. There is little agreement, however, on the nature and aims of reparative justice. There is a strong association, and many consider it central or obvious, between reparative justice and restitution or compensation through transfers of money or other materially valuable goods. One paradigmatic practice is tort law, and the central principle is that of compensating persons injured by wrongful conduct so as to restore the antecedent status of the wronged party, or to provide equivalent or replacement value for damage to her interests or well-being. The other historical referent attached directly to the term reparations is the post-war punitive practice between nations of losers being compelled to pay winners for the losses suffered in conflict, as in the familiar case of reparations exacted from Germany by victorious nations after the First World War. In the later 20th century, however, a new practice of reparations has emerged. It's been initiated by nations, elaborated in the jurisprudence of international courts, and embedded in United Nations guidelines for combating impunity and making remedies available to victims of grave human rights abuses. As a result, the very concept of reparations has shifted rapidly and dramatically from a transaction between states to an obligation of states, and possibly by analogy, other entities, churches, corporations, other institutions, to redress individuals by means of diverse forms of reparations that may include but go beyond restitution or compensation. The basic principle of reparations in this new international setting, affirmed by the UN General Assembly in 2006, after a couple decades of study, is that victims of gross violations of international human rights law, the laws of war, or international human rights law, or serious violations of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, should be provided with full and effective reparation, which is enumerated in terms of several distinct forms: restitution, material compensation, rehabilitation through legal, medical, and social services, guarantees of non-repetition through institutional reform, and a curious category called satisfaction, which comprises diverse measures that include truth-telling, public apologies, commemorations, exhuming human remains from atrocities, educational activities, among others. Now, I can talk a little more later, which I've been thinking about why I take this practice as a sort of touchstone for theorizing reparations, but I won't be doing that right here. Instead, I'm asking this question: can any significant unity be found in the guiding concern of reparative justice that also helps to explain the different demands reparative justice makes in different situations, which seems to be embedded in this practice, both concerning the transfer of money or material goods and these many other gestures of reparation? I explore here the domain and demands of reparative justice as a response to what I call moral vulnerability. By moral vulnerability, I mean exposure to possible insult and injury to a victim's moral status that always inheres in the sequel to substantial wrongs and wrongful harms. It's the possibility that these wrongs will not be recognized as wrongs, or that the victim will not be seen as deserving of redress. The moral status under threat is the victim's standing within practices of accountability that position individuals in reciprocal relations of accountability. Significant wrongs and wrongful harms and losses provide the occasion of reparative justice, and restitution or material compensation on some such occasions may be necessary or may even be uniquely effective as a measure of reparations. Yet, on my view, the concern and aim of reparative practices is always also, and sometimes primarily, to recognize and address the moral vulnerabilities of victims of serious wrongs. So the paper now is going to divide into about half of it is about how I'm using what I mean by accountability relations, and then the other half is back to reparations proper. It's widely acknowledged that reparations cannot just consist in the tendering of goods or money to those who have suffered grave wrongs and wrongful harms. And Bernard Boxall made this point several decades ago in the brief flurry of literature on black reparations that emerged in the early 1970s. Compensation can be purely remedial and forward-looking, seeking to create fair distributions or equality of opportunity without addressing effects of wrongful treatment or injustice. Compensation can also be a charitable act impelled by compassion for loss and unjust suffering that comes from those who accept no responsibility or bear no relationship to a wrong. The very concept of reparations, however, seems deeply connected with issues of wrongfulness and responsibility. In order to capture the widely shared sense that reparative justice and reparations involve issues of wrong, responsibility, and just redress, I characterize reparations in this way. So this is what I'm talking about. Reparations consist in responsible parties intentionally giving appropriate goods to victims of wrong, and an act that expresses acknowledgement of the wrong, responsibility for the wrong or its repair, which are the same, and intention of rendering just treatment deserved by the victim in virtue of being wronged. This characterization only tells what kinds of acts count as reparations. They must directly communicate recognition of the reality and nature of wrongs, the insult and harm suffered by the victim in wrongful treatment, the victim's deservingness of repair as a matter of justice, and the responsibility of those offering reparations to take up the demand of reparative justice. But what most fundamentally does reparative justice concern, and to what must it respond? Now, I'm going to suggest the key lies in a form of relationship that is constitutive of morality in actual life, relations of accountability that connect individuals to others through recognition of their responsibilities under shared norms. The norms that structure accountability relations are norms for acceptable conduct. Norms for acceptable conduct include norms for acceptable responses to unacceptable conduct, conduct that has failed to observe mutually recognized norms. Wrongs always in principle pose a set of questions and a set of potential threats to the structure of accountability and to those who see themselves as parties to it. I call the threat that serious wrongs pose moral vulnerability, that is, a particular kind of vulnerability that arises from our participation in practices of accountability, under circumstances where serious violations have occurred. To be vulnerable in its primary and root meaning is to be capable of being wounded. Moral vulnerability involves a particular kind of wound that may afflict those who stand in or who think they stand in or aspire to stand in reciprocal relations of accountability based in mutually recognized standards, when this reciprocity is not acknowledged. To be a participant in practices of accountability, to borrow some language from P.F. Strawson's classic essay, is to be viewed as an apt target, pending excuse or exemption, for demands for accountability by others in virtue of how we behave. But Strawson reminded us that not all of us are seen all of the time as eligible and competent participants. To be a human actor not seen as eligible or competent by others is to be viewed by them, in Strawson's language, with an objective attitude. Viewed in this way, human beings are seen as falling outside, either wholly or in part, the form of relationship experienced by those who see themselves in each other as eligible and competent. That relationship is one of accountability. In it, we suffer the demands of others on us to render accounts of our conduct, and we're unexcused to accept responsibility. And in turn, we enjoy the standing to make similar claims upon others. The standing to hold and to be held to account is what makes one a participant. And being able to hold others and being oneself held to account in particular ways characterizes one's relative position as a participant in these practices of accountability. To possess this standing is a kind of recognition and empowerment, although its consequences on either side can be onerous. The situation I call moral vulnerability is one in which one may fail to be recognized as a participant, or as the kind of participant one believes one is entitled to be, in a fairly direct way, which I'm going to talk about more. One may also find that the norms governing relations of accountability are in some crucial respects not as one believes that they are or should be. So my theory is that reparative justice actually aims to maintain accountability relations by tending to addressing this moral vulnerability. It does justice not simply by remediating wrongful loss and suffering, which is where the emphasis has tended to be, but more fundamentally by responding to our right to have purchase on others' due attention when we suffer unacceptable treatment. Because wrongful harm and loss of material, physical, psychological, and social sorts is so obviously the occasion of reparations, it can obscure the presence and import of specifically moral vulnerability. But if the whole concern of reparations really were indemnification or making good for loss, it is unclear why reparations would demand the acknowledgement of wrong and responsibility to repair it as a matter of justice. I mean, if the point is loss, and loss is covered, whether it's the insurance company or a generous neighbor next door, what's the whole business about requiring acknowledgement of wrong and responsibility? Well, I think it lies in understanding the nature of accountability, especially under the pressure of wrongdoing that has occurred. Accountability is a relation. Accountability is a relation. To be accountable is to be accountable to someone in the matter of one's conduct. The most minimal sense of accountability is answerability. One is obliged to inform others concerning one's conduct and activity. More specifically, one is obliged to answer with explanations or justifications that are responsive to others' legitimate interests and expectations in regard to that behavior, with the prospect of being exonerated or found blameworthy by others for it. It's easy to kind of elide the answerability part of accountability and go straight to the next aspect, but it turns out that's important not to do that. Another meaning of accountability is, the more common one, liability to sanction. That is, exposure to penalty or punishment for behavior that fails, without excuse or justification, to satisfy a requirement or normative expectation. That is, an expectation about how others should behave that can be based on law, morality, agreement, or common understandings. Behavior that violates standards or norms creates a warrant for inflicting disapproval or reproof and enforcing some demands on the violator in the form of punishment, penalty, or amends. Common morality depends on the assumption that each competent and self-controlling agent is answerable to some others, whether or not any sanction beyond disapproval or reproach can be applied. In the optimal case, the offending party is called to answer, so stands under a requirement of answerability, and where lacking excuse or justification, to accept the consequences. That is, to accept liability to at least negative judgment, but also potentially to demands for remedial action. If this is what accountability means in its most elementary form, answerability that opens at least the possibility of negative assessment and its potentially demanding consequences, there are vulnerabilities on both sides of an alleged wrongdoing. The apparent wrongdoer is vulnerable to misplaced demands for accounting, or to attributions of fault or responsibility that might be unreasonable or unfair. If you're a participant, you're liable to be asked to account with possibly negative implications, but not all instances in which people are called to accounting are in fact reasonable and fair. It's interesting to me that in discussions of reparations for historical injustices especially, but also atrocities and systemic violence, the cogency or fairness of placing responsibility on particular parties, and hence the consequences of that, is most often discussed. For instance, whether currently living people can bear responsibilities of reparation for injustices committed long before they existed, or for their eventual effects, whether being under others' authority or being influenced by intense situational pressures constitute excusing circumstances, as in war atrocities, or whether some are unfairly scapegoated if they are held responsible when some others who behave similarly are not. So these are all questions about the moral vulnerability of the putative wrongdoer. I intend here to examine the moral vulnerability, the exposure to a moral wound of the wronged individual or group. The potential wound is to be ignored or repudiated in one's standing to demand an account from another for conduct one believes is seriously wrong. So from the point of view of the apparent wrongdoer, freedom from accountability to others is a standing beyond participant relations. This is the most profound form of impunity. Not merely freedom, this is where the answerability liability distinction comes in, not merely freedom from punishment or sanction, but exemption from the most basic kind of accountability, the obligation to answer for one's conduct to some or all others. From the point of view of the apparent victim, The victim's inability effectively to command accounts from others for apparent wrongdoing raises questions about whether the victim enjoys the standing of a participant in relations of accountability. Suppose X is the apparent agent of wrongful hurt, harm, or loss. Then X stands liable to accounting, assessment, and pressures for sanction or reparation. The apparent victim should be able to demand an account of X, to confront X with a negative assessment, and possibly to demand satisfaction from X in the support of others in seeking satisfaction, whether it's through reproach, punishment, or amends from X. The ability to do these things I'm referring to is a standing within relations of accountability that must be recognized by others. Indeed, that must be recognized by others, not to a physical or psychological capability. So the victim's specifically moral vulnerability concerns whether the victim does enjoy that standing. The victim is morally vulnerable to finding that others, including but not only the perpetrator of a wrongful harm, do not recognize the wrong done, or do not recognize that the victim can call that offender to account, or do not recognize the victim as protected by the norms that the victim appeals to in the negative assessment of the offender, or do not recognize or support the victim's demands on the offender or others for satisfaction or redress. So there potentially could be a lot of different things going on. I come back to that. The potential moral wound for the victim lies in being disqualified, degraded, or excluded from fully reciprocal accountability relations, at least in a given instance. A self-described victim may, of course, be simply mistaken or out of bounds in claiming wrongs, assigning responsibility, or putting demands. In speaking of reparations, however, we're typically speaking of very grave wrongs. Wrongs such as assaults to physical, psychological, and social well-being, denial of rights, subject to inhumane or humiliating treatment or deprivation, significant destruction or alienation of property, livelihood, or heritage. These are the contexts in which we speak of not just amends, but reparations. These are profound insults to well-being and dignity, and those who experience them will feel themselves grossly ill-treated, even if their social or legal positions exclude them from fully reciprocal accountability. If they demand justice, and in the case of oppressed groups, some invariably do, they bid for some or greater recognition that something is owed to them for a real wrong and the harms it inflicts. They're often at the same time claiming a participant role in accountability relations that remains uncertain or that has actually been denied to them in the past. They seek moral validation, at least moral validation, from the perpetrator of a wrong or from others. The wrong is real, its wrongfulness is clear, that someone else bears responsibility, and that others owe an accounting and may be liable for sanction or redress. Now, moral validation might not be forthcoming from wrongdoers themselves, who may be intransigent or remorseless if they are identified or available at all. And in fact, in political cases, the bigger the crime, the worse the atrocity. Usually, the less likely it is that anyone is going to be willing to take any responsibility. It's also true that victims do not always value or respect an affirmation of standards from wrongdoers, whom they may view as untrustworthy, if not depraved or contemptible. In any case, wrongdoers are only in a position belatedly to affirm their own recognition of the authority of violated moral standards and the legitimate claim of the victim. Wrongdoers are not usually in a position to affirm either that standards are authoritative for a community or that the victim is within the community's protective concern. And of course, the exception to that is when the state is the wrongdoer. The state is in that position. And indeed, for this very reason, I have argued and continue to think that there is always a collective or communal responsibility for moral validation in the case of grave wrongs that alone can fully meet the threat of moral vulnerability. Now, where moral validation is desired or sought by victims of apparently serious wrongs, but it is not forthcoming, what does it mean? It might mean that the facts or seriousness of the violation are in doubt or uncertain in the eyes of others. It might mean that the moral standards that define wrongs in the victim's eyes are questioned or rejected by others. It might mean that the facts concerning responsibility are uncertain. For example, that the victim is in whole or in part to blame, one might think. Or that standards of responsibility are unclear or contested in the kind of case at issue, and of course this plays a huge role in arguments about historical injustice. Is anybody responsible now for what happened so long ago? If moral validation is not forthcoming, at least the judgment of the victim concerning wrong and responsibility is in question. The victim's standing to enter claims to accountability need not be impugned. But sometimes that's the issue. Challenges to the victim's perception of wrong and responsibility in some cases indicates a kind of discrediting or disqualification of the victim's standing to make a judgment with the authority of group norms. And this in turn can mean that the victim is perceived as somehow not a normal or representative or authoritative judge who embodies the community's point of view. On the other hand, the victim's attempt to enter accountability claims may also be blocked if the victim is not seen as the kind of person protected by standards that protect others, or at least not at the hands of the perpetrator in question, or if the alleged wrongdoer is not viewed as subject to the standards invoked, or at least not in the case of the victim in question. Consider the history of domestic violence, being recognized as violence. It can mean that the victim does not possess socially recognized authority to press accountability upon the supposed wrongdoer. In these cases, there is a question of what standing the victim has or lacks in relations of accountability. Where those who see themselves as seriously and grossly wronged fail to receive validation, it's not always clear which of these situations obtain. So it's first of all not necessarily clear whether there is a failure to be seen by others as having the standing to call them to account, or it can be any number of other kinds of failures of having your judgment, your perception of the wrong, your judgment of responsibility endorsed. This is the reason that acknowledgement of wrong and responsibility, I'm arguing, is crucial in constituting reparations. It's the clarity and adequacy of acknowledgement that resolves these questions in favor of the victim standing as a full participant with others, under shared standards, and one whose claims concerning wrong and redress require respectful attention. When this acknowledgement and responsiveness is refused, or if it remains confused, especially by the community to whom the victim appeals, the threat of moral diminishment, exclusion, or abandonment is realized. The victim is subject to the response, "You are in no position to make demands on us." That's the realization, in a nutshell, of what the threat of moral vulnerability is. You have no standing to make demands. We can ignore you. That is to say, the victim's standing as a participant in reciprocal practices of accountability is either unrecognized or denied, at least with respect to some wrongs the victim experiences as urgent and damaging. Okay, now I go back to reparations proper. Once moral vulnerability is recognized as the underlying issue in redressing wrongs, the establishment of genuinely reciprocal accountability being the issue, and once the multiple facets of that standing that might be compromised or denied are exposed, I think we can make better and more precise sense of what is at stake in redress or reparations. Differences in what reparations concretely demand in a given case will track the presence or absence of moral vulnerability, the kind and extent of moral vulnerability that looms, or the nature and depth of the actual wound of moral diminishment, exclusion, or abandonment that individuals and groups have endured in some cases in addition to their wrongful injuries and losses. Reparations in all cases in some ways necessarily are backwards looking. They look not only to a wrong done, but I'm arguing to the threat of moral vulnerability. Will the victim be able to call anyone to account? Or in cases where the victim's standing has in fact been questioned or denied, then reparations need to focus on healing the wound of exclusion or abandonment. Cases that call for reparations, however, vary greatly in the defining dimension of moral vulnerability. If there is no salient or serious threat to the victim's standing in an instance of wrongdoing, a simple apology or a straightforward compensatory transaction can be sufficient to rectify a breach in conduct that doesn't reveal a gap in accountability and the mutual recognition it signifies. If there is an accountability gap, however, the nature of the gap matters and may itself become the site of other challenges and fresh wounds. In disputes about fact or history, parties may see each other as merely mistaken, or some parties may arrogate to themselves the authority to define the situation, where moral values or standards of responsibility between victims and responsible parties fail to converge. It matters whether this is a disagreement among equals or evidence that some parties refuse to apply values or principles to certain individuals or groups. In cases of historical injustice, individuals or groups bring forward offenses and damages previously denied or rationalized with reparative demands that encompass a long history of exclusion, subjection, violence, stigma, or exploitation. In many cases, there is a history of previous rebuffs to earlier demands. The classic case of this are slavery reparations, which have been sought since, I think, before the Civil War, and that's ongoing. In every case, reparations will have different hurdles to clear, and different kinds of communicative and reconstructive work will be necessary between the parties. And I'm saying that's because the real issue is moral vulnerability, the vulnerability to the fact that one lacks the standing to call others to account. Reparations also have forward-looking aims. Discussions of reparations that emphasize the element of acknowledgement often speak of the aim of reparations as achieving respectful relations, restored trust, or a reestablishment or establishment of the victim's equality. I argue that even if these goals to establish respect, trust, and equality are the ultimate or regulative ideals of reparative practice, there are more immediate questions about inclusion and recognition in mutually understood accountability relations that are at stake in reparation struggles. It's unwise and implausible to burden reparations efforts with too much responsibility for good future relations for two reasons. First, to do so diverts attention from what I am arguing is the primary locus of the actual process of reparations. If you read this literature, you can kind of get whiplash with the argument, it's backward looking, it's forward looking, it's backward looking, it's forward looking. Okay, I've got a new idea. That the primary locus of the actual process of reparations is a negotiation of accountability in the present in response to a sorry past. I'll say more about that. Second, to do so, that is to claim that reparations actually create these equal or trusting and so on relations, is to conflate reparations efforts with fulfilling the demands of reparative justice with the achievement of substantial reconciliation. Reconciliation is an independent notion. Whether or not justice is required for reconciliation is a real question, but they're not the same thing. These two issues are linked. First, when reparations are about the reparations really being about the present, first, when reparations are made, they call the parties to the reparations process to a shared attempt at convergent judgments of wrong and responsibility, and to jointly meaningful action responsive, both to the wrongful harms done and, I'm arguing, to whatever threats of moral vulnerability they reveal. The scene of this attempt at renegotiating accountability relations is the here and now. An interesting fact about actual reparations movements, proposals, and programs is the degree to which the problems and concerns to be faced are often, perhaps typically, only fully revealed in the event. That is, in the demands, rebuffs, proposals, debates, negotiations, and agreements that occur in the course of an attempt to get or even talk about reparations. I believe this is explained by the fact that moral vulnerabilities are multiple, complicated, and not always clearly visible to the parties. They express themselves in the event in which reparations are offered or sought, as this is the process that exposes disparate perceptions of wrong, of harm, of responsibility, of standing, and of the obligation, and whose obligation it is to repair, even to arrive at a determination of what is wrong about what happened in the past, and who is responsible for it or for its repair, no small feat in many cases, does not necessarily reveal the full condition of moral vulnerability, or the extent to which its threat has been realized. This is a substantial and hard part of the work of reparations in the present. Those who suffer moral vulnerability, who find themselves in some way lacking in the standing to call others to account, will feel it acutely. They may be infuriated by the questions raised about their understanding of the facts and the wrongs of the matter that have been done to them. And they may be outraged by the fact that those to whom they want to assign responsibility often have the power, socially, institutionally, and politically, to appoint themselves arbiters of the nature of harms and the validity of responsibility claims. They may be frustrated by the degree to which their claims meet with confident or casual rejection, deemed obviously false, incredible, or exaggerated. It is true that those seeking reparations might be mistaken in these feelings and the perceptions that ground them. It's also possible that they might be experiencing precisely an asymmetry in relations of accountability, one that shifts the burden of proof and justification onto them, even as it tilts the balance of respect and credibility away from them. In other words, the interaction tends to recapitulate the asymmetrical relations of accountability that already exist. Issues of moral vulnerability can seem diffuse and abstract relative to the harms victims grieve and for which they seek reparations. These are harms such as lost years of wrongful imprisonment or the deprivation of professional work, the ravages of torture, the disappearance of a child, or the dispossession, decimation, enslavement, or subjugation of a people. It's obvious in many cases that what has been lost can never be returned or compensated. No one knows this better than the victims. The struggle for reparations is nonetheless crucial to see whose claims will be acknowledged and whose responsibility will be established. Without understanding the role of moral vulnerability, one doesn't understand what is at stake in reparations attempts and why they proceed as they do. Often reparations or reparations demands come in waves or in fits and starts, as partial acknowledgement, rebuffs, offers, shifts in perspective, and historical and political developments within or around the struggle unfold. This is most so in reparations for structural injustices or mass violence in the national or international political arena. Reparations, I suggest, are really about a present encounter in which those held responsible for reparation and those seeking it, and possibly others, struggle over mutually acceptable interpretations of the past they share, and try to negotiate an interaction in the present that models fair terms of reciprocal recognition and accountability. Underscore models, back to that. The moment that a search for reparations truly engages is a moment of considerable uncertainty for all parties. For those who had confidently ignored or denied others' claims of injustice and injury are responding newly both to the claims but also to a new standing, a possible new standing for the claimants. Those putting claims are beginning to exercise powers and might experience leverage and opportunity long denied them. This means that things are already not what they were, but are not yet what they need to become. One might characterize the relationship among the parties as the possibility of reparations dawns and momentum for reparations builds as a midway, if not a mid-air position in terms of accountability. Reparations are about where the parties can get to in the present in an attempt to transform what had been their relative positions in the past. A reparations effort might best be seen as a bridge from a past not just of unrepaired harms or uncompensated losses, but of accountability denied, to a future of reciprocal accountability established. Seeing it in this way brings into focus the intricacy of the threats, wounds, tentative steps, and difficult new understandings that are characteristic of the reparative process. Now, this leads me back to the second point, that it's unrealistic to expect from reparations measures too much and implausible to explain the function of discrete gestures or programs of reparations too much in terms of actually realizing desirable but distant future relations. It's true, ideally, that the establishment of fair terms of accountability and shared recognition of moral standards should forecast better future relations. It's certainly true that successful reparations are in part successful if and because they render parties to the interaction hopeful about future relations. A measure of success is whether the parties are moved to try to fulfill the promise for a possible future that reparations token. Successful reparations, I'm saying, ignite hope. Hope involves energized attention, imagination, alertness to possible routes to a goal, and the resilience to keep looking for and trying them. But reparations given are best understood as a marker only of present achievement in the history of relations among people or among peoples, an achievement measured by its distance from the past scene of wrongdoing. With respect to the future, reparations can only at best model or set an example and make a promise or a commitment based on what is achieved in the present instance. The idea that they actually achieve trusting, respectful, and compassionate or equal relationships asks too much. This is especially true in the aftermath of gross and massive violence or intergenerational injustice. That they give reasons and create motivation to entertain possibilities for building trusting, respectful, more equal and compassionate relations is a more fitting goal. As the wrongs of the past have made reasonable fear, disillusionment, hatred, or cynicism, the present at best gives reasons for hope by creating a sense of possibility. And hope gives opportunities to build the relations that a successful reparative interaction exemplifies and models, and at best begins. I don't think it's wise to claim that it builds those relations, but it supplies a model, and in the best case, kindles receptiveness and motivation for that construction project over time and under tests. This underscores the important point that reparations do not, in many cases, close the books. They instead get parties on the same page concerning accountability from here forward. Conclusion. Am I saying then that reparations are not really about the money? No. I have argued that we can make sense of significant differences in a large range of reparations contexts by viewing the core issue of reparations as the negotiation by the parties of mutually acceptable standings in accountability relations governed by shared norms. Not to enjoy such a standing is to be morally vulnerable, not only to harm, but to lacking an effective claim upon those responsible in the event of harm. Yet money or other material transfers are often very much at issue. Rather than saying that it is, and I can talk more about this later, what's the money doing, or what is it about money? Rather than saying that it is not about money, I'll say sometimes it is crucially about material or restitution or compensation because of the nature and history of certain wrongs. For example, decades of exploited slave and then undercompensated labor. There's a money issue there. Cases where people have been dispossessed of ancestral land. There's a material issue there about the return of land. So sometimes there's a crucial issue about material restitution or compensation because of the nature and history of certain wrongs, but that's not so in every case. Where material restitution or compensation is appropriate or imperative, on the other hand, it still matters what the money or goods and the transactions surrounding them are understood to mean. The question is, what conditions and communications permit money to carry or cohere with the necessary messages of acknowledgement that distinguish reparations from indemnification, charity, political expediency, or purely forward-looking attempts at distributive justice. And I have another paper that actually explores specifically the different communicative dimensions of the reparations interaction. In other words, what does the vehicle have to do, or what is the sort of communicative gesture it has to constitute that makes it play as reparations? Quick jump to the end. I've argued that the moral vulnerability that adheres in accountability relations is the thread that runs through diverse cases and helps to explain the variety and meaning of reparative responses. It's not only harm and loss, but the nature and extent, I've suggested, of moral vulnerability inherent in unredressed wrongs that offers a unifying view of the diverse tasks of reparations.